Hello, everybody. My name is Alberto Highlander. I am the EU project coordinator for IAP Nordic, Nordic chapter of IAP. And just to make sure we are in our series of webinar. This is the last webinar of this season, which is on digital accessibility in the Nordic countries. I have to say that this webinar has been arranged kind of in the last minute because of the webinar that was planned for today about accessibility in a large organization for different reasons was postponed, and we will have this webinar later on in spring. So today we will talk about how well the different Nordic countries are performing when it comes to accessibility. And we have today for that Susanna Laurin from Funka. Before we start, I would like to go through the housekeeping rules. So please use the QA function if you'd like to ask a question. Your camera and microphone are now disabled, but please raise your hand or use the raise hand function if you prefer asking a question verbally. And we are having some issues today with the automatically caption. We are working on it, and hopefully we will get started as soon as possible, but it should be working soon, and we apologize for that. A little bit update of what's going on with the Nordic chapter, IAP Nordic chapter. We're working on we keep working on the translation of the website. The Danish website is going to be coming up soon. We have made some improvement in the Finnish one and working on the Norwegian one too. So please stay tuned. We are also working on different drop-ins localized in the Nordic countries. So for spring, we'll be having drop-in sessions both in all the Nordic countries, in Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and also recently in Iceland, because I have to say that last week we got the first member of IAP in Iceland. So I'm really happy for that, and I really hope that we can get more Icelandic members in IAP. So please reach out when all these drop-in sessions are set. I will appreciate it. You can spread the word. And for you that are not familiar with the concept of drop-in, a drop-in is basically an informative session where we invite members from IAP, and we can it's an open discussion where people interested in IAP can ask questions about membership, certifications, and we just keep it as an open discussion. We are also keeping on the webinars. So for spring, we are working on a new series of webinars. So please stay tuned because new dates are coming up, and you're more than welcome to suggest ideas or which kind of topics or questions you would like to address in our webinars. So I think that's all from my side. You are always welcome to reach out to me. You have my information on the website, and later on I will pass you my email address. So with no further ado, I will leave the floor to Susanna Laurin. Hello, Susanna.
Hello, Alberto. Thank you. So hello from London. I am currently at the TechShare Pro conference, but this is my hotel room that you see in the background. So representing IAAP EU actually in this event. So now turning to IAAP Nordic instead of the EU, but I hope this will work out fine. So I've been asked to do a presentation on digital accessibility in the Nordics. and I'll be really happy to do so. And just a little bit of update on how we, well, first a bit about me, maybe. I am the Research and Innovation Officer at Funka. I'm also the chair of the Joint Working Group for e-accessibility, managing ETSI, SEN, and SEN-CENELEC work on the standardization for presumed conformance of the European legislation. So very busy now until 2025. And I'm also the G3ICT and IWP representative to the EU. And I'm also working together with Alberto with the Nordic chapter, of course. So as Alberto mentioned, we just got our first member from Iceland, which is really nice. Now we can use the 5 flags. And I think, Alberto, you forgot Finland when you said where we were going to do drop-in sessions, but we are planning drop-in sessions and informational webinars in all the Nordic countries now. So finally, we have the 5 flags. I'm really happy about that. But today, this is an impossible illustration, but I think it's very funny. So I'm not sure how to explain what it is, but it's a kind of an illustration, rather ugly, with many different colors on how the EU system works and what is the European Union, the Eurozone, the European Economic Area, the free trade, the EFTA Free Trade Association, where the Schengen is, and so on, and the flags and Brexit and so on. So this is how complex the world is for us who work at the EU level. And just to tell you that why we talk about the IWP EU is not really true, because we also cover Norway, and we also cover UK, and we also cover Switzerland. So it's kind of EU with family and friends. But today's webinar is going to be divided into the EU part of the Nordic and Norway on the side of that, because we don't yet have the same regulations, and that means that we don't have the same reporting system, so we can't really compare. So I don't want to point to Norway and say that Norway is different in any way. Norway is our greatest friend, but right now we have data on Denmark, Finland, and Sweden that is more similar, and then Norway is still a little bit on the side. This will change, but that's just to tell you that right now this webinar is going to focus on Denmark, Sweden, and Finland, the first part. So we did a review of the Web Accessibility Directive, we being Funka, together with PricewaterhouseCoopers, Interlera, and Open Evidence. And this has been reported to the Commission quite long ago, but the report is still not published. And we have asked for the publication date. That is not decided yet, but I hope and think it will come very soon and be public. So the main tasks of that review was to evaluate the progress and of the objectives and key measures of the directive. So did the directive do what it was supposed to do, and what was the result of the first monitoring period? We were also supposed to map relevant technological advances, to look at the emerging technologies and how they support accessibility, how they can support auditing or testing, how they can support for the users or for the publishers, and so on. And then also, of course, to make sure that we don't only do this in a theoretical way, but very much in involving all the stakeholders. So we did public and targeted consultations during the whole period. And the review was an 18-month long assignment, so it was a rather comprehensive task. The information gathering, except for the desk research, of course, was the open public consultation. So for all members of the EU, and also people outside of the EU could actually answer as well. And that was the first time in ever that an EU-based open public consultation was also provided in easy to read. And that is now, at least in parts of the Commission, seen as kind of the guiding principle for other open public consultations, at least the ones that have some kind of social impact or cover also people with disabilities. And for us working with accessibility, this is kind of self-evident, but of course, many more people chose to respond to the easy to read version, not only people with disabilities, but also many others who just thought that the kind of the real open public consultation was too cumbersome, and not least the login piece on that. We also did targeted surveys with all monitoring agencies and parts of the industry and end user organizations, researchers, and so on. And also, of course, read all the monitoring reports, because all of the EU member states were supposed to do, not only carry out the monitoring, but also report back to the Commission. And only a couple of countries still haven't reported, but the vast majority have. We also carried out interviews with the monitoring agencies and also with many other stakeholders as well, policymakers and end user representations and so on, and did quite a lot of desk research. So all of that together then resulted in this big report that is supposed to be published soon. The main findings, with kind of a touch of Nordic here, is that most of the review results was really quite positive. So, and that is for me, who have been working with accessibility for such a long time, it's really rewarding to find things that are positive, because sometimes it feels like we're always pointing to bad things and looking at problems. But we found really many good things. And I think the most rewarding for me personally was that the monitoring was so well received. So more than 90% of the public sector bodies where we have some kind of data from has seen the monitoring as something positive. So it's not only kind of policing top down, but it's more of the fire brigade coming to help you. That has also been said by the monitoring agencies, that they've just a very few public sector bodies have reacted negative, but really the vast majority very positive. And especially in Denmark and Sweden, according to the reporting, the public sector bodies not only were positive by being monitored, but also actually started quite soon to fix things, so that they could see when they did before and after testing that there was an increase in accessibility after they got the first report. So monitoring does work, which is very cool, because this is something rather unique for the EU. So I think this is something we could export. Also, we could see that there is really an increased awareness, and that's of course sometimes in combination with the monitoring, when you get to know that you are going to be monitored in some cases, or you just get the report without being noticed before, and that does increase awareness. And all the monitoring agencies and almost all stakeholders said that the directive has led to increased awareness at many different levels, and that is the same in the Nordic countries as in all member states. We also see a very clear increase of demand of expertise in web accessibility. That is also something reported all over across Europe in all member states. And we also see it very clearly, especially in Sweden, but also in Denmark and Finland report the same thing. But in the Swedish report, it's very prominent that there is not enough experts. So if you are not already an accessibility expert, or if you have friends or family want to have a really good job, encourage them to become accessibility experts, because we will need many more boots on the ground, no matter how much the automation of accessibility still improves every day. We will still need more experts around. Around the user involvement, I put it on the good news. It is both good and bad. It's not always good the way the users have been involved. It's not perfect yet, far from. But in many countries where they claimed in the beginning of this process that they would have problem with involving users, or they didn't know how to reach them and so on, still all the member states in one way or another have actually involved users. And from my point of view, at least better than I had expected. Maybe that says more about my preconception, but users end users with disabilities should be involved both in the selection process of which websites to monitor, and also they can be then consulted during the whole time, but specifically it's written that they need to be consulted. And I'll get back to how that looks in the Nordic countries. Another interesting thing is that both monitoring agencies, the governments and the public sector bodies overall say that benefits outweigh the cost of the directive. And this again feeds back into what happened during the transposition process, where we had at least half of the member states, maybe more, saying this will never work. We don't have the resources. This is impossible. You are asking too much. And they were very, very negative and tried to push back on this. Now people are happy, monitoring works, and the benefits outweighs the costs. So very good. There are, of course, exceptions also here. For example, universities that claim that really it is too costly to make all the training material and so on accessible. But in general, this is a very positive result. Another interesting thing is that the the possibility to claim disproportionate burden is very rarely used. That is also across member states. And at least in Sweden, in the Swedish report, it says clearly that they have not seen it at all. Nobody is claiming, none of the monitored agencies have claimed disproportionate burden. So that is interesting, because that is kind of the sneaky way out if you don't think or believe that you can, or that it's feasible to become accessible, then you can always try to claim disproportionate burden. But that has not been used at all as much as we feared it would be. Still, there is, of course, room for improvement, as always. So, for example, almost no website is accessible. So we have a couple of examples of member states claiming that something is fully accessible. I must say, I kind of doubt that it's true, but the 85 to 90% of the websites and apps are in the partially compliant piece. So they do comply in some places, but not on everything. So we have very few websites that are accessible and almost no apps. And of course, this is the first time we monitor. So next time the whole of EU is going to monitor this, we will hopefully see an increase in the number of websites and apps that are accessible. The feedback mechanism, which I think is the most beautiful piece of the whole legislation, which is where you are required as a public sector body to provide a way for end users to provide feedback, so that you get to know what the problems are from the user perspective without paying for it. And you can also have a direct communication to the end user to try to solve or mitigate the problem. That feedback mechanism is working, but it is far too little used. So Funka, EDF, and many other organizations, also at the EU level, and some of the monitoring agencies, are now really focusing on teaching end users to become more aware about the possibilities and their right to provide feedback, and also a way to provide constructive feedback. So there are loads of initiatives going around, and also research projects around this. And I really hope to see a big improvement here, because when the users are active and engaged and constructive in providing feedback, that is really kind of a positive loop also for the public sector and the wider community. And I always want to say that it is always the public sector body that has the responsibility to make something accessible. It's not, the responsibility does not lay on the end user, of course, but if the end user has time and energy enough to do something, it's really welcome. We have another problem, and that is that quite a few of the member states use tools that are not created for the European market. So they kind of fail when it comes to their exact monitoring, because they are not really using all the requirements of the EN standard, but just the merely the WCAG parts. I'll get back to that when it comes to the Nordic countries. Also connected to not using the EN and also to many other aspects, I think, is that all user needs are not always covered. That is a requirement in the legislation, but some of the member states focus very much on screen reader use and visually impaired users, which of course has to do with the way the standards are put together. But it's also something we really need the member states to focus on in the upcoming years, so that they have a very broad perspective when they do their monitoring and testing. And again, everyone says the same thing. There is a lack of resources when it comes to competence. We need more boots on the ground, and that is, of course, what IAAP is working to achieve: more trained accessibility experts, and also people who are not experts, but are UX designers, developers, content managers, project managers, who touch upon accessibility to raise the level of knowledge and experience from them. So some more concrete examples from the study. When it comes to the end user involvement, Denmark has a monitoring committee that provides input quarterly, very ambitious. And they have invited a long list of disabled persons organizations to this monitoring committee. In Finland, there has been so far an annual hearing, so also covering many of the disabled persons organizations and so on, and also something ongoing, but not as often as the Danish initiative. In Sweden, this has so far been much more ad hoc, and partly because the monitoring agency was actually created very close to the start of the monitoring period, or the activities around the directive. the authority claims not to have had the time to really engage with end users as they would have liked to. So the first round of stakeholder involvement was just via email sent out to a list of stakeholders, and then after that they have also done a little bit more specific outreach to end users and disabled persons organizations when it comes to the selection of the mobile apps, if I remember correctly. So here we see a big difference in how this is taken care of in the Nordic countries. If we look at the sample for monitoring, Denmark, so the monitoring methodology of the directive is has two parts: the simplified monitoring, where you monitor many websites, but not with all requirements. That is to test for non-compliance. And then you have the in-depth monitoring, where you are supposed to monitor a smaller proportion and a smaller number of websites and apps, but then you have to monitor the whole, all criteria in the standard. So in Denmark, they were supposed to do 120, so the number of monitored websites and apps has to do with the number of inhabitants. So it differs depending on how big the member state is. Denmark was supposed to do 192 simplified websites, or do simplified monitoring of 192 websites, and they did. And they were also supposed to do 24 in-depth monitoring of websites and 4 in-depth monitoring of apps. They did all of that, but in a little cheeky way that I don't think it's forbidden, but it's definitely not what the legislator envisioned. So they reused the same sites. So it's not 192 plus 21, which was the idea. It is 192, and then they took the results of 21 of those and made in-depth monitoring of them as well. So very efficient way of doing the monitoring, but my hope is that we'll do it in another way next time. Finland, they did the simplified monitored of 105 websites, but they were supposed to do 185 based on the number of inhabitants in Finland. And when it comes to the in-depth monitoring, they did 20 websites and 4 apps, which was exactly what they were supposed to do. So in Finland, they did too little out of the simplified websites, and I will get back to the reason for that. In Sweden, 282 websites were monitored with the simplified methodology, which was the number that was assigned to Sweden. 19 websites out of the 25 that was supposed to be in-depth monitored were made, and only 2 out of the 6 apps that was supposed to be monitored in depth were done. So in Finland, we had too few instances of simplified monitoring, and in Sweden, we had too few of the in-depth monitoring. So the countries don't really do exactly what they're supposed to do. This is not, it's hard to compare 100% because all countries have done slightly different things or kind of interpreted things in a different way. But I think it's interesting for me when I looked at the Nordic proportion of the cohort here, that we have these kinds of problems in our rich countries. So we are not performing better than countries that are more immature and I think clearly have less funding for this. So I don't think this result is really good. When it comes to the requirements tested, only 5 of the member states did what they were supposed to do, tested the full EN 301-549 Annex A. Sweden is one of the countries that was doing this. And when I say 5 member states, that's not really true. It's 4 member states plus the UK. 4 of the member states did parts of the EN 301-549 Annex A, so most of it, but not all of it. 11 member states only checked WCAG criteria, and Denmark and Finland are among those member states. And this, again, has to do with, at least partly, that they chose to have tools that were created in the US, and they also had either internal competence or external competence looking at how to do this with the WCAG criteria and the W3C training and so on. 5 member states only selected parts of WCAG to monitor. So that's even less good performing. If we have a legislation and we say these are the minimum requirements, you can't kind of cherry pick just pieces of it. That doesn't really work. So it's really hard to compare exactly the results of all of this because the member states had not done it exactly the way they were supposed to do it. But good on Sweden, they did everything they should when it comes to the requirements. The accessibility statement is something that needs to be checked because it's supposed to be part of the page selection when you do the monitoring. But the member states have looked differently as to how much energy they should use on kind of checking the accessibility statement as such. So 21 of the member states only check the availability of an accessibility statement, which is what they're supposed to do. And 5 member states do even more than they are required. They validate the content. And Finland is one of the countries who also validate the content of the accessibility statement. So points for Finland here. So when we look at the tests carried out in the Nordic countries, in the simplified monitoring, Denmark used a fully automated way of doing this. Sorry, Denmark used a fully automated simplified monitoring methodology. Finland used the automatic one, plus they also checked manually. So they didn't just do the automatic testing, but also tested manually, also in the simplified monitoring. And Sweden did a fully automated test when it came to the simplified monitoring. And here it's interesting to compare with other member states. We have member states doing fully automated, automatic plus manual, and we also have member states doing only manual in the simplified monitoring. The in-depth monitoring, where we check all the criteria and really check for accessibility, whereas simplified is checking for non-compliance. In the in-depth monitoring, Denmark used external experts to do it for them. So the monitoring agency procured a company or a supplier to do the testing. Finland, they did external experts, having them to do the monitoring, and they also tested specifically with assistive technology. And in Sweden, they used internal experts. So the monitoring agency actually themselves did the monitoring. And this may, of course, also have an impact on the methods and the documentation and how you interpret different things. When it comes to the mobile apps, Denmark tested with Android and iOS. Finland also tested with Android and iOS, and Sweden only tested with iOS. And again, that is not the way the legislator would like this to happen, and I'm quite sure that Sweden will try test also with Android in the next monitoring phase. It's again, they claim it's because they didn't have the time to arrange it. When it comes to the tools used in testing, so the automatic tools that are either the only basis for the simplified or a part of the testing for the simplified, and also automatic tools used like color contrast analyzer or things like that is supporting the manual testing. 14 of the member states use free tools, and that goes for both Denmark, Finland, and Sweden. So Denmark and Finland use the Portuguese monitoring agency has created a tool that is now possible to use free of charge. It's called CallWeb. And Sweden used the Spanish equivalent, so the OAW. So all of the 3 Nordic countries have chosen kind of a similar path. They are looking at countries that have come longer than themselves, that have been monitoring this longer than we have, and picked a tool from them and used the same one. So that is, of course, a very efficient way of doing it. And you know that the tool is working in a good way and is very suitable for monitoring. Some of the other free tools used are based on the US legislation, which means that they're not very suitable. And some of them are also more made for auditing and less for monitoring. So some of the member states are struggling with understanding the results that they get from the monitoring and so on. 3 member states use commercial tools, and 6 member states use tools that they have developed themselves. When it comes to the user involvement in the actual testing, 5 member states do explicitly do user testing. So not only having experts with accessibility issues or assistive technology doing the expert evaluation, but actually providing it to kind of external users who are the man in the street kind of users, so not experts. 19 of the member states claim to test with screen readers. Finland is one of those. And 4 member states test with other assistive technology. And I know that in the Swedish report, it says that if it's needed, they also do screen reader tests, but that is not documented. So we don't know really if that happened or if it's often happening. And the reason we have divided this into screen readers and other assistive technology is again because we see this bias towards testing on for visual impairments. And really the member states that also test with other types of assistive technology is of course encouraged, because that means that they also take care of the other user groups in a good way. When it comes to the compliance status, which means the result, how do we report on the result? Is something accessible or not accessible? There is a way to do that, a method for this, where it's divided into 3 parts, which is not compliant, partially compliant, and fully compliant, and that is in the implementation act of the directive. So the idea was that all the member states would report this in the same way, but 18 of the member states used the required status. So those member states reporting is at least in theory possible to compare, but 8 member states do not use the required status. Denmark and Sweden have created their own compliance status, and I don't mean that that is a bad thing to do. It just makes it extremely hard to compare with other member states. And Finland doesn't report on compliance status, which is also a little bit odd, but they have a lot of detailed information about each website and app they have tested. So of course, it's possible to derive some data from there, but they don't really report it in the non-compliant, partially compliant, fully compliant way that all other member states do. When it comes to transparency, another important aspect of the whole legislation and enforcement, half of the member states that responded to this, they do publish results. That is, Denmark, Finland, and Sweden are part of the ones who publish results, and 12 do not publish the results. This is very, very much a cultural or historical background. It's kind of how you do other things. If you are a transparent country when it comes to other things, I think that kind of it goes very closely with the rest of the policies. And 2 member states did not yet share anything, not with the public sector body that they have monitored, and not with the general public when this research was done. I hope that is no longer the case, but this was this spring. And there are also some member states, unfortunately not in the Nordic countries, but there are member states that go beyond the minimum requirements when it comes to the monitoring of the directive. For example, there are countries checking for plain language, also for sign language in some of the German Bundesländer. Some countries also check some of the private sector bodies that are not part of the directive, but of course it's possible to also see how they are doing. And around half of the member states include the schools and kindergartens in the directive. This is where it's a flexibility so that the member states are entitled to choose if they want schools and kindergartens to be in scope or not. And then some of the member states also monitor schools and kindergartens when it comes to accessibility. Some member states also monitor live video, even though that is an exception or exempt from the directive. And some of the member states also check for office file formats when they do their monitoring. And even third-party content is sometimes monitored, but I think that is just 1 or 2 member states doing that. So I think the level of ambition is quite high generally in the member states, and we can't kind of point to one doing absolutely nothing and one doing everything, but it's kind of a mix. They do some things good and something less good, but really the level of ambition is really rewarding. I think it says something about the urgency of this topic, and that it has become much more on the agenda generally. And now let's go to beautiful Norway. The Web Accessibility Directive, as Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein are in the European Economic Area, so part of the EFTA, but as we saw in the illustration there. So these 3 countries, they will now they need to comply with the regulation, the directives of the European Union, but they do apply it after some specific negotiations, and they need to, of course, do it in their own way. So it's harmonizing with their own legislation and so on. But in Norway, the Web Accessibility Directive will apply from the 1st of February next year. So when we do this webinar after a year or so, we will have the same kind of reporting in Norway, the same kind of monitoring and the same kind of reporting that we have in the EU countries. So that will make it much easier to do a good comparison. The current monitoring methodology in Norway has been thematic. So they don't do loads of full reporting or full monitoring of everything on a website. Also, the legislation is different. So they are not supposed to cover everything, but what the reports that they do publish are a very small number. So in 2020, they published 4 reports, and they have tested, in some cases 7, in some cases 17, and in some cases 19 success criteria. So that is really hard to get an overview. They are also reporting on failures and mistakes, but they don't find all of them serious enough or critical enough to make a notice out of. So they have a completely different way of kind of weighing and the balance of this. In 2021, they have 5 reports published, and all of them have 11 criteria tested. And in general, these websites have 7 to 8 issues per site. But the thematic idea of the monitoring in Norway also means that they probably will select the areas where there are problems, because that is the idea of kind of choosing. We have this sector this year, or this type of content this year, and then we monitor in different ways. So it's a quite interesting way of doing kind of spot checks, but really making it important to focus on the right things. And when we look at the selection criteria for Norway, the selection is based on different studies and investigations and mapping, saying that this part of the society or this part of websites tend to have problems, and also the number of users, so kind of a risk-based selection. What they don't do, or at least don't report of doing, is really talking to the end users and involving the disabled persons organization in this selection process. Maybe they do, but they don't write about it, at least publicly. They do give notice on beforehand. So before they start a monitoring process, they tell the agency that they are supposed to do this. This is something that is less often happening in the EU. Specifically in the simplified monitoring piece, most of the member states, also in the Nordic countries, say that we don't want to tell them on beforehand, because then they start doing things. So we want to test the reality, and that's why we just test it and then we tell them afterwards. There are exceptions of that, but in Norway, you get to know that you are going to be monitored. And then the sampling of the pages, that is in the Implementation Act. So you need to sample the kind of a specific number of websites and different types of websites, and have different formats and so on. So that is kind of specified in the EU legislation. But in Norway, the sampling is based on a dialogue with the website owner. So that is a completely different way of doing this. And there are pros and cons of both, of course, but I think it's kind of a nice and gentle way to do this, to say, we are going to monitor you. Please, can you let us know which pages you would like us to monitor, which are the most important content maybe, or which ones are most used by users. I don't know how they do the sampling, but I can imagine something in that direction. On the other hand, if the agency would, or organization, because this is of course both private and public. In Norway, the legislation covers both. So if the organization that is going to be monitored is a bad one, they could potentially say, look at these sites pages instead, because these are the simple ones, the only ones that we know are really important, and then we kind of hide the complex ones somewhere else. I don't think that is how people would do it, but that is of course the weakness with the dialogue-based sampling. The testing methodology in Norway is based on WCAG 2.0. This will also, of course, be updated in February. The legislation does not require an accessibility statement, so they do not check that now, of course. There is also no real procedure or methodology around the feedback mechanism, so that will also change. And there are also some other updates to the law that needs to happen when they enter into the Web Accessibility Directive ecosystem. The monitoring agency in Norway have internal experts doing their monitoring, and they claim to use both automatic tools, a semi-automatic approach, and completely manual testing. So they do all of it, and according to the number of days they claim to use for the monitoring and the small number of websites they actually do test, I think this is a very thorough and time-consuming maybe, or very qualitative way of doing testing. And back in the days, Funka was also involved in supporting them when they built this methodology, but many things has happened after that, so I'm not sure exactly how they do it these days. So, conclusions of all of that. What can we actually say? We can say that the status of the Nordics in general, we can do much better, because we used to be, or at least Sweden used to be, one of the top 3 or top 5 or so when we started to monitoring web accessibility for the Commission many years ago. That's no longer the case. Many other countries have been coming up to speed, and they are now kind of overtaking on a fast track. So I think we are rich countries, we are rather small countries, we know what we're doing, at least in public sector. The vast majority of organizations, they know about accessibility. This is not new to them. Even if we haven't had legislation before, we still had very kind of strong recommendations. So I think we should do much better than we are doing right now. I think we could also learn from each other. I know the monitoring agencies, both in the Nordics and also in the Baltics, they do speak a lot. They have a network or a community where they share knowledge and also share ideas about tools and so on. But I think there's even more we could learn from each other. Just looking at this from the outside, I see things that happens differently in the different countries, and I would kind of wish that they would work more closely together and really take their best parts from each other's methodologies and processes and keep going from there. The involvement of users can really be improved, I think, and I definitely think that is a key message for everyone who wants to do accessibility, to involve users in every way that you possibly can, and that goes also for the monitoring agencies, of course. And also the training and support piece is happening in the Nordic countries, but I think it could be even more so, because still we see a big lack of expertise and competence among the website owners and also the suppliers who sell to public sector. And we just simply don't have enough boots on the ground again, even if we see new accessibility expert companies popping up. And also we do a lot of training, and IAAP is doing certification of more and more kind of generalist ICT companies that learn more about accessibility, but it's still a big gap, and many more people need to be knowledgeable about this. So I really think, even if part of it is up to the market, I think the monitoring agencies could also really maybe work together with the market, I don't know, but really focus on training and support is, I think, really the key for success here. So I was asked who is the best one in the Nordic countries, because we don't measure the same way, we don't even have the same legislation, and these countries are among those who report the least comparable data. That was kind of an impossible quest for today. But if I need to tell you a winner of this, I will say, do we have drums somewhere here? Finland. For different reasons. I think the Finnish approach to this whole thing is the most sustainable one. They work closest with the end users, and they are also very active and in their training sessions and so on. And I like the way that they are involving different stakeholders, and they are also always the coolest gang in this pack. They have this fantastic sauna quality of their life. I'm showing just a funny picture of people throwing around snow outside of a sauna in Finland. So that's why I give the first prize to Finland, but I think we can all do better together. And I hope that we really can explore accessibility and the way we do monitoring, and of course, the way we do accessibility work, and make sure that we connect in a better way. And I've talked to Alberto also and the Advisory Council of IWP Nordic that we will next year focus more on the interaction between the countries. And of course, we will also invite the monitoring agencies so that they can speak about this. This was now too late for this because it came really late, the postponement of this. So, but we will do more around the same topic next year. So with that, I think we will open the floor for questions. So let me see. Will you be able to understand why they didn't follow the guidelines? Did they lack the competence themselves? Oh, that is a that is a tricky question. So in the interviews I had with all the monitoring agencies, I managed to understand quite a lot of the kind of the background and so on this. And some of the reporting we have done in the review is reported to the Commission in what is called a staff working document. And is not always being public. So I think most of it, I need to be general here because I don't want to point fingers, but I think generally when a country didn't follow the implementation acts, it was either that they actually thought they were following them and just interpreted it in a way that the Commission didn't expect. So it could be just a simple misunderstanding. In some cases, we see that maybe a misunderstanding and a lack of competence. I think it's a lack of maybe experience in this. Some of the member states really think, or the monitoring agencies, they feel that they know what accessibility is, and they have been working with it. But when they are supposed to do this in a very kind of structured way and really documenting things, they realize that this is much harder than we thought, and we didn't really do a setup that worked in a good way. And that is, I think, both true for the ones that had external experts coming in, because then the experts said, we do this way. And that may not have really been a good combination or match with the monitoring methodology, because of course the experts didn't use the monitoring methodology before because it was the first time. And then if the monitoring agency doesn't have very clear views on exactly how to do this and how to follow it, they may just say, okay, you're the expert, so you do it, you decide. So that is also, some of the monitoring agencies said, hey, we did the best we could, but our expert said WCAG is the shit, so we will just cover the WCAG, or our tool is just covering WCAG. So, and I think that is, of course, it's easier to be led in a wrong direction if you don't have the experience. So I think a combination, but I don't think anyone, well, there may be a couple of exceptions, but at least not in the Nordic countries. I don't think anyone kind of tried to dodge, and that's not the impression I had, at least from the interviews and the kind of the surveys and everything we did with the monitoring agencies. But again, a lack of experience and expertise. So another question here, do you think that a closer cooperation between the different Nordic monitoring agencies would be possible? If so, what would be needed to promote this cooperation? Well, as I said, I know they do collaborate. So, and I don't think it's up to me or anyone else to tell them what to do or how to do that. But I know that there is a majority of the member states in the WADEX group, which is the group where kind of under the European Commission, where the experts and monitoring agency and policymakers meet to discuss this. There is always a need for more discussions, more meetups, more workshops, more collaboration, more learning, sharing, and so on. And they all say the same thing. And then I think it's a little bit difficult maybe for them being in a maybe very bureaucratic organization, a lot of legal requirements around them, and they can't really just do what they like to do to get this collaboration going. So I have said that I think it would be good to have somebody kind of facilitating this and trying to lead them in the right direction, because the Commission doesn't do that. But so far we haven't been awarded that job, at least. But I think there is a real need for it, and also a willingness from the member states to share and to explore and to do things, and it is happening. But I still think we could would learn more from each other, especially in the Nordics, because we are so similar. And the next question is, do you think there is a risk that the same thing, which is, I think, the ability to follow the guidelines, will happen with the Accessibility Act? That concerns me. Well, you never know, who can tell about the future, but I must say, after all these years I've been doing EU legislation and policy work, I think we are in a much better place when it comes to the Accessibility Act. It is a more complex legislation, and God only knows that the standards will be more complex as well. But the commercial sector and the big banks and e-commerce and all of these sectors that are covered by the Accessibility Act, they are so much more aware and on their toes and kind of awake now, 3 years before they actually need to comply with the regulations. 3 years before the Web Accessibility Directive entered into force, the public sector was sleeping. 95% of them were still sleeping. We and others were kind of, hello, there will be legislation. Ooh, we tried to say something, and then they go, oh, what happened? Why didn't anyone tell me this? So that is a completely new, different attitude towards the upcoming legislation. And I think that is not because these other sectors are more nice to people with disabilities, but they usually have a compliance officer, or they're kind of working with their legal requirements in another way. And also they do really see the return on investment here. I think that is a big difference as well. So I'm really happy. I'm positive that we will see a better implementation of the Accessibility Act than we did with the Web Accessibility Directive, but I may be wrong. So we have 7 minutes to go. So I think we should maybe stop here. No, I got another question. Any tips on how to motivate leaders in taking accessibility seriously? Many still skip over it as a good to have, not a must have. Mostly they see no consequences. They see no consequences. So I think it really depends on what leader it is, what context or company or organization it is. But for us in Funka, we have worked in this field for more than 20 years and long before the legislation entered into force. And I think I know that is correct with the same for many of our colleagues in the industry in other countries as well that didn't have legislation before the directive. So we never used the kind of the whip here, but only the carrot or the stick, sorry. So I really think it's about understanding the benefits of being accessible, and I would try with the UX and design pieces of this, because that is something everyone can understand. Don't make it too technical. Don't start with talking about the standards and the regulations and everything. I would go, it makes your website better. It makes your website look better. It's easier for your mother to use it or whatever. Just try to be very kind of human and say that this is something that should be self-evident and positive for everyone, and not making it too kind of complex. Of course, there are complexities and there are technical parts, but usually, at least the way we have approached this over the years, it has much more to do with, well, if you have a website or if you have an app, then probably you want somebody to use it. So why don't try to make more people use it? I think that's one of the really beautiful things in the Accessibility Act. It says that the whole aim of that directive is to maximize the foreseeable use of products and services. I think that is really, that to me, that tells me everything about what accessibility is enough about. Oh, now the questions keep coming. Would you say that the punishments for non-compliance for companies regarding digital accessibility should be a bit harder? What are your thoughts about this topic? No, personally, I don't believe in penalties. I don't think the stick is the thing. And I base that on what is happening in the US. The whole litigation piece is not what I think we should try to strive for. I think, at least in the northern and central parts of Europe, I think naming and shaming is efficient enough. And in the Accessibility Act, there's also a possibility to take products off market, which I think is the hardest punishment of all. But I may be wrong, but I don't personally think that the penalties and fines are the way to go. I don't think that is how we move this forward. but many people argue against me, I know that. So a little bit about what is happening. So as Alberto said, this is the last webinar we do in the IWP Nordic series before Christmas. But we have some upcoming events in IWP EU that I think can be interesting for you. On the 22nd of November, we have a webinar with Daniel Montalvo from W3C. He's talking about how to build, compare, and select courses on web accessibility. On the 29th of November, we have a webinar with Harmonie Altinier from Coena. She's talking about ableism and digital accessibility from a French citizen's point of view. So those are the two last webinars from the EU webinar series this year. On the 24th of November, we are IWP EU and IWP DACH. Oops.
Yes, the 24th of November, IAP and the German chapter, the chapter for the German-speaking countries and regions, we are having a session, drop-in session, where Susanna will be speaking in German, talking about the EU policy and the benefits regarding IAP memberships and certifications. Same thing will be happening on the 7th of December. This a drop-in session, not only based for you, all the members from the Nordic countries, of course, are welcome to join, but the scope is a little bit broader, and we will our aim is to cover the whole European Union. The 9th of December, there will be one more drop-in session about EU policy with a session for Q&A that will be in Czech, but it will be translated, simultaneously translated into English. So there is, very exciting events coming up. So just please stay tuned. On all the information will be on our website, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Thank you for the next and final picture of today's session. And I will really appreciate any comment, ideas on topics, speakers for next webinars are more than welcome. You are free to reach me on my email address, ahighlander@accessibilityassociation.org. And you are also welcome to reach me on social media. And with that, I think we are set for today. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending. You will get, of course, as usual, a thank you email with the link for the recording as soon as possible. And thank you so much, Susanna, for today. Really extremely interesting presentation. I appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. And now I will go out and see if this was a real fire alarm or not. I should keep moving. Thank you for listening, everyone, and always happy to talk to you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.